Okay, so today we're going to be looking at An Autumn Day by Sorley MacLean. We only have two more poems to look at from the SQA collection. So we're going to be looking at An Autumn Day, and then we're going to look at Halig. And basically, this poem deals with MacLean's experiences. I mean, obviously, like we've said many times before on the channel, the poet could be just taking, the position of being a speaker and describing, an experience through the mind of a character. In any case, in any case, doing some research on the poem, I found out that MacLean essentially took part in World War II, and he was a soldier in North Africa during World War II, and so it's very likely that this poem, if not, you know, an actual snapshot of something he experienced, was at the very least informed by his experiences in the war in North Africa. Okay, uh, so let's have a look. All right, all right. So anyway, the poem is called An Autumn Day. Okay. Now, just to begin with, the use of seasons in poetry, the use of seasons in poetry and in literature in general is very common. The use of seasons in poetry and literature in general is very common. It's one of them. It's the changing of the seasons is one of the sort of most basic human, experiences. If you think about our lives and our existence in the world, uh, one of the things that we would have noticed and that would have been, something that stood out to us from the very beginning of, you know, human time or human consciousness is the changing of the seasons. This would have been especially pronounced when we actually lived out in the wild, not just because of aesthetically in terms of the way that the land around us would have looked, but more so in terms of, so that would be one thing that's very clear, especially if you live, let's just say in the majority of the planet. And then there's differences obviously when you go to some of the extremes where it's not very seasonal, but in the majority of the planet, there are different seasons. And so for our ancestors and obviously for ourselves too, we know that the year is changing because the world around us begins to look different, or the sky, the weather acts differently. Like it rains more at this part of the year, it might snow at this time of the year, it's more sunny at this time of the year. So the world around us literally changes, and um, again, this would be aesthetically in terms of like the way things look, like the trees change color and the grass changes color and all that. But also you need to keep in mind that the world around us would have changed um, physically as well, not just in terms of how it looked, but for example, during different parts of the year, the water levels in certain places would, say for example, if it rains more at a certain time of the year, then it means that this is the time where, it would be a good idea to have your seeds in the ground so that the rain could land on them, and then you would have crops. That means you can eat, you know what I'm saying? You can grow crops, and that way you can feed your family, and you would have a successful farm. Excuse me, as opposed to, for example, if you plant at a different time of the year where there's no rain, or if it's snow and ice instead, and then all your seeds will die. Yeah. So basically, knowing and having a good understanding of the seasons was of critical importance to our ancestors, not just because of the way that things looked, but also because of, in order to live their lives and to survive, the seasons would have dictated a lot of their choices. Okay, and we know that there's all through history, there's been different people that have migrated, for example, following different animals who have different habits during different parts of the year. In any case, the seasons have always been extremely important to human existence and to the human experience, so it makes complete sense that our artists and poets and writers and storytellers would have picked this up and used it in their writing. Now, I say all that to say that autumn is one of the most sort of classically used seasons in terms of art and literature. Autumn has often been called the poet's favorite month. I believe the romantic poets, and now I'm talking about the time period romantic poets. Yeah, they often said that this was their favorite month because it was the not month, sorry, season, because this is the season when everything came into its fullness, where things were the most ripe and ready to harvest. So there's the most color and most diversity. Everything looks like it's reached its peak. But there is something else which is also associated with autumn, and that is obviously the falling of the leaves and the beginning. If you imagine that autumn is the peak of the seasons in terms of things becoming fully mature and ripe. If spring is the beginning, where you can imagine it's like being like a child. Summertime would be like the youth, the and the sort of being like imagine like a teenager or something like that, or being like, teenage to young adult slash adult. Autumn would be the fullness of adulthood, touching on the becoming of like old age, the coming of old age, and obviously old age and death would be winter. So autumn combines the fullness. Autumn combines the fullness of life. It's uh, life at its highest uh peak, if you like. It's when everything is at its most full and at its most alive, if you like. But because it's at its most alive that it will ever be, it means that it's knocking on the door of death. Because the only thing after this, there's no more growth after autumn. Everything is fully grown. So the next thing is death. And we begin to see the death immediately in this season of autumn because the leaves on the trees begin to fall away. Things begin to fall and die. You understand? Now, this ties to MacLean's work. Okay, this ties into MacLean's work very clearly in that it is a big contrast. And like we've seen in his other poetry, contrast is a major feature in, I'd say, every poem that we've looked at. He in every single one of them, he will put things together which seem to be opposites or in contrast. Like for example, in I Give You Immortality, he talks about how the woman is extremely beautiful, but at the same time, he describes her as being like arrows to him, meaning a symbol of death, something beautiful which kills you. So here we have autumn, which is the time where everything is most alive, and simultaneously the time where everything begins to die. It's like a big contrast. So, excuse me, carrying on this idea of things falling to the ground, what he does, okay, is he uses this autumn season, this metaphor, to symbolize war and the death of soldiers. And what he's going to describe in this very short poem is his experience, or I should say, the speaker's experience of his comrades, his fellow soldiers dying around him while he doesn't die. So he's going to describe what that's like. And just in terms of the things that I said a minute ago, with the autumn being the fullness of life, and yet it's the beginning of death, you can see that in war, it's the young that die. In war, it's always the young that die, the young soldiers who die, often young men, or most of the time young men who die. And these young men were not dying, okay, but they die in the war. Their life is taken from them, almost or in a sense unnaturally. Unnaturally, it's like, and if you look at the lectures that I've done on Wilfred Owen's poetry, you can see that very clearly, how he talks about war being an extremely unnatural thing, excuse me, that kills the young when they're very much still alive. Okay. Anyway, so we now get into the actual poem itself. So he begins on that slope on an autumn day. The shells, I think you pronounce it sowing. I don't think it's soughing, sowing. I'm not sure. I think it's sowing. I'm not sure. Anyway, I've got the definition of it here because it's a very unusual type of word. The shells sewing about my ears and 6 dead men at my shoulder, dead and stiff and frozen were it not for the heat, as if they were waiting for a message. Okay, so, excuse me. So he sets the scene. He's on a slope, he's on some kind of hill on an autumn day. And just on that autumn day, that would capture everything that I've just mentioned before about the seasons and everything else. The shells whistling, rushing, moaning about my ears, meaning that he is describing the situation as he is there with his fellow soldiers and bombs are being thrown at them, bombs are being dropped on them, and they can hear the bombs whistling past them, and they're just essentially before this moment they would be praying and hoping that one of the bombs doesn't land on them. But unfortunately, it does. It does. 6 dead men at my shoulder, dead and stiff and frozen were it not for the heat. As we mentioned before, the theater of war that he took part in was in North Africa, which is a hot place. It's a desert sort of place. Um, and frozen were it not for the heat, as if they were waiting for a message. So these men, these fellow soldiers of his, have been killed by one of these bombs, and they are now dead, and the way he describes death and again, his use of contrast here, frozen if it's not for the heat. The way he describes death is it is something which has frozen them in time. In other words, it is something which has almost put like a pause on them in whatever expression they had or whatever whatever they were doing. As soon as the bomb landed, they were cut off from everything, yeah, from everything. So it's almost like they were excuse me. It's almost like if you see those old mammoth skeletons, I think you would call them, that get flash frozen because they get stuck in something and then like there's I don't know, there's some kind of water or something that goes past or something. Hmm. Excuse me, something happens to where I don't know how it works, I'm not a scientist, but something happens to where the body of the animal gets essentially captured in ice, in thick ice, and it gets found later, thousands of years later, we dig them up and they're still stuck in that same position that they were, when they died and they got frozen in the ice. So what he's saying is that death is like that. Death, the icy hands of death gripped these soldiers and then they were paused forever in in that they now have no more ability to do anything. Their agency and their will, their life force was cut off, finished. And so they can no longer do anything because they are now dead. So it's a very interesting way of describing death. And philosophically, this description of death is different from this description of death is very different from like classic religious or spiritual thinking about death. In that this description of death, normally when people describe death, and they describe life overall, excuse me. Normally when people describe death and life, fix my hair. Normally, when people describe death and life, they describe death as being one stage in a journey. In other words, they don't describe death as being like a stopping point or being like an end point or being like a pausing point. They describe death as being one step and then there being something afterwards. Like they wouldn't say, you don't say a person stopped there, you'd say a person passed on or passed away, right? Meaning that they passed, meaning that they're traveling somewhere else. That's like the classic spiritual religious type of view or take on death and life as well. It's like a either cyclical or it's a journey progressing to another stage. Here, that he's not taking that approach at all. What he's saying instead is that they were stopped, paused, cut off, finished. So he's taking a very much more nihilistic, materialistic, um, um, cold, pessimistic, not hopeful, not warm, not. It's normally when we say these things, he passed on, he passed away, it's because we're adding a level of hope and love and positivity and keep your chin up. We're adding all of that to the description so that it's not like cold, not like the universe just like killed this person and that's it. Yeah, there's nothing like it was meaningless essentially and pointless. We don't say that kind of thing. Uh, excuse me, I would say intuitively because we kind of understand. Excuse me, we kind of have an understanding, intuitive understanding that it doesn't feel right, right? It just doesn't feel right that this is that you live and you die and there was no point. That doesn't feel right to us. And we have an intuitive feeling that there's more. But anyway, he's not taking that approach. He's taking the approach of this is it, that's it, death, done, finished, which would tie more in line with the other sort of anti-war poets and writers who want to make sure that we recognize that war itself is terrible and war itself has no happy, positive, romantic side to it. It's bad. We should stop it because there is no sort of glory in it. Huh? It's a very, it reminds me of like a quote, um, that the, excuse me, war is most desired by people who have never fought in it. War is most desired by people who have never fought in it, which is a very extremely true quote. So anyway, the soldiers and the warriors are always the ones who hate the thing, but it's the people who don't fight and who would never be called to fight and who wouldn't fight if they were called upon to fight, who always seem to describe it in a sort of romantic type of way. In any case, he says as if they were waiting for a message, as if they were waiting for a message. So it's if they're dead, but it seems as if they're still sitting there waiting, as if they're waiting for something more, but they're dead, they're gone, they're finished. Okay. And it's almost more tragic in that they are dead, but it's as if they were waiting for like another command, that these men were so loyal and so obedient to their position and so committed to their job that as if even in death they're still waiting for the command, for what to do next. Okay, anyway, so when the screech came out of the sun, out of an invisible throbbing, the flame leaped. Excuse me. The flame leaped, and the smoke climbed and surged every way, blinding of eyes, splitting of hearing. So, so he says when the screech came out of the sun, that'll be the missile or the bomb came out of the sun, meaning it came from the direction out of the sun. So they were blinded; they couldn't see it. They couldn't see it because it was coming towards them from the sun. Out of an invisible throbbing, the flame leapt and the smoke climbed and surged every way. This is when the bomb landed, and there was a firestorm around them and smoke. And it's a very nice, nice description, and you can almost see it and smell it and imagine it. Blinding of eyes, splitting of hearing. This is when the bomb landed, and the flash blinded them, and the thunder of the bomb made them unable to hear properly. Um, excuse me. And after it, the 6 dead men the whole day, among the shells, snoring in the morning, and again at midday and in the evening. One election took them and did not take me, without asking us which was better or worse. It seemed as devilishly indifferent as the shells. 6 men dead at my shoulder on an autumn day. So The lines in this poem, they're extremely powerful, and you can tell the sort of emotions that he was feeling, when he wrote them, in that feeling just a sort of sense of, despair, and a sense that this is also pointless, and a sense of, guilt almost, that why wasn't I killed? Why were my, brothers in arms killed instead of me? I wasn't any better than they were. Feeling, excuse me, a sense of loss of faith, and a loss of, you know, one of the things that happened during, post World War Two, one of the things that happened post World War Two was a real sort of shaking up of people's philosophical structures and ideas. They call this the post-modern period. The modern period came before this, and this the post-modern period. Um, One of the things that happened in this time period, post-war time period, is, and maybe even before this, post World War One. One of the things that really happened was that people's ideas and philosophical structures began to, be shattered, especially those people who experienced the war firsthand, like soldiers or the families of soldiers and people who lost people. Their philosophical structures became shattered because, you know, before this, to a large extent, they were living in a world which had sort of organized rules and ideas and good and evil. Everything had its sort of place. You had the empire, which was controlling things, keeping things in order. Excuse me. You had organized Christianity, which of course there was wars, back in the day, but generally speaking, you had organized Christianity, you had organized religion, you had family structure, you had communities, you had the empire, like I said, you belonged to a nation, one nation or another nation. So you had very, very strong philosophical, and you had the Victorian period, which when you had, organized morality, you had people essentially writing books on how to behave and, good behavior, good manners and everything. So you had a world which was extremely organized and extremely well ordered and extremely well put together. You had a world where everything had its place, and you knew who the good people were and you knew who the evil people were. And the classic Victorian adventure story, you have the hero who is good, right? He might have a little bit of, not even really actually. I was gonna say he might have a little bit of bad to him, but not really. Not if you look at the. Okay, maybe, yeah. Maybe he has a little bit of shade of darkness to him, shade, but not, he's not bad at it. He has a shade of darkness. Barring Jekyll and Hyde, yeah, it's a different story. Generally speaking, look at the classic Victorian adventure stories. Look at, for example, any of the Three Musketeers stories. Look at any of Jules Verne's work. Look at excuse me, look at any of the Dickens stories. Oliver Twist is not a bad guy, he's a good guy. In all of those stories, the main character is always sort of 99% good, if not 100% good. And they have clear opponents that are bad. Okay, like the people oppressing Oliver Twist, keeping him down, abusing him. There's always some enemy which is clear and distinct and outside and bad, completely bad. Understand? So Uh, this is the classic Victorian story, and the good guy beats the bad guy at the end. That's like the story always. The good guy always wins. But but excuse me. But you go forward in history, okay, to the modern period and then the postmodern period, and then the stories begin to change. Stories begin to change to stories where the hero is no longer good or bad. They are extremely complicated. Understand? They're extremely complicated. Where you now have people questioning the structures and the questioning the structures and the way that the world works. For example, like in excuse me, for example, in like Miller's work, where what is it, Death of a Salesman? You have Death of a Salesman, where you have the lead character is essentially like he kills himself in the end. He's a very flawed. He's extremely flawed. You couldn't really call him a hero. There's no real bad guy except himself. He causes his own downfall. For example, Crap's last tape, the play which the man's on the stage surrounded by darkness. There's no real plot. It's even many of the ideas of, what is the story itself is completely shattered. It's completely different to the earlier Victorian stuff. And the reason is because people have become traumatized and their entire world was shook by the bombs of war. So they no longer can just have a simple understanding of reality and of life because they know that that's not how things are anymore. They don't trust in those stories anymore, including the religious stories, which told them that, excuse me, if they prayed enough or if they gave enough charity, then their children would be protected, they would be protected. But they did these things and their sons died and their brothers died, their fathers died. And so now they're all shook up, and they no longer know. And they had the idea that the empire would protect them and the borders were safe. But then London was bombed, uh, or if they were living in other places in Europe, those places were bombed. So the world was very shaken, is what I'm trying to say. And people's philosophical ideas were extremely shaken. And we're still feeling the reverberations from those shakes, I would say, to this day. But in any case, he's writing this, and these emotions he's feeling is very expressive of that being shook, being shaken philosophically, feeling as if life is pointless, the universe is random, there is no meaning, and things are cruel, and we're just born and we die randomly. That's how he's feeling in this moment. Um, he says, six dead men the whole day among the shells, snoring in the morning. So he's making a sort of, it's not really a joke, but he's being a bit humorous, I guess. I don't know yet. Snoring in the morning among the shells, meaning that they're dead. They're just lying there. No one has taken them, and the bombs are still going off. Excuse me. And again at midday and again at evening. So the enemy is has no mercy. The enemy, long forgotten, is the rules of engagement in terms of like give mercy to your opponent, like the old knight stories or the old Victorian stories. You might point your sword at the opponent, and then your opponent yields, and you don't kill him, and then he becomes your friend. That's all gone. Here is just cold, harsh war and brutality. That these men are dead, his friends are dead, and he still has to run for cover. He still can't do anything to help them because the bombs are still raining on him, and the other people are still alive. One election took them and did not take me without asking us which was better or worse. One election. What does this mean? Excuse me. An election is obviously understood to be something like a vote, where you vote on who is in power. One election took them and did not take me without asking us which was better or which was worse. So again, it's almost as if he's making a joke here. And there's contrast again without asking us. But the point of an election is to ask the populace who should be in charge. So it's almost as if he's making a joke that there is no choice in terms of who died or who didn't die. And so again, he's sort of picking at and criticizing the ideas of being positive or optimistic about life or the universe, or being sort of thinking about the idea that if you make the right decisions, if you make the right choices, if you pray enough, if you are good enough, then you'll be protected, and you'll be God will save you and protect you. It seemed as devilishly indifferent as the shells. Excuse me. So again, he's saying that the bombs themselves are random, that they're not really made for anyone in particular specifically, that they're just random. Again, picking at the idea of like those things that I said before. Um, Now the other thing, one election, it could have another meaning, maybe something more strictly to do with like the military. Maybe if someone has more experience, they can let me know. But in general, it's picking at these ideas, like I said. Six men dead at my shoulder on an autumn day. Six men dead at my shoulder on an autumn day. And that's it. Yeah, that's where the poem ends. There's nothing else added to it. There's no sort of relief. There's no philosophical optimism offered. There's nothing offered which would say six men dead on autumn day, but we were able to do this, this, this. There's nothing offered as a way of relief. And again, this is sort of very much in line with postmodern type of theme or movement or style, if you like, in which everything is pointless and there is no relief given. There is no like good side. There is no like positive. It's just life is hell or life is tragic, and that's it. Yeah, that's the end. So obviously, it's quite a dark poem. It's a very powerful poem, a very strongly anti-war poem. As is every single poem I've read from a soldier has been an anti-war. Every single poem I've read from a soldier who has actually fought in the war, fought in a war, like the Owen poetry from the First War, this poetry from, the Second War. Every single poem or work of art that has come from a soldier or a person who's actually participated in war has always been anti-war. Has always been anti-war, and that should tell you something. Should give you some idea about the reality, the nature of war. This is also true in terms of anyone that's lived a real life, in terms of having to deal with real violence in real life, which unfortunately I have. I wish I would not have had to, but unfortunately that's just how things go. In which there is no sort of giddiness about having to deal with real violence. There's not like an excitement about it. It's not fun. You would not want to do it. And the idea is to try and push us away from that and to push towards peace. Peace, right? So anyway, that's the poem. That's the poem. I think maybe that'd be my explanation of the poem in terms of the sort of what you call it, literature side of it. I think philosophically, if I call myself a philosopher, I think philosophically it'd be important for me to offer you something so that you don't just follow this and end up sort of super depressed and nihilistic yourself. So philosophically, what I would say is that yes, you need to have a more complex understanding of like reality than, the very simple good guy, bad guy, so on. But no, things are not just random, and no, things are not just what do you call it, meaningless or hopeless or pointless. Um, but the reality is, if I could boil things down, the reality is that you just have to take much more responsibility and accountability in terms of yourself and your own choices. And the reality is that you ultimately, though there are many things you can't control, obviously, like where the bombs drop and all that, but there are many things that you can control, and you just have to focus on those things which you can control and do your best to do good with those and to live a good life yourself. And you might think, why should I? What's the point? The point is, it's something you can remember. Both good and evil people suffer. Both of us, we both suffer. Good and evil, both. You can't get away from it. But only the good are given a break from their suffering, whereas the evil increase it with every evil thing that they do. Um, I'll give and what I mean is that only the good can feel love, only the good can feel joy, only the good can feel hope and friendship and family and all that. The evil can't feel that yet. So if you start to do things which would increase suffering for other people because you want to take revenge or you think the world's pointless or something, you will only do that at the price of your own joy, happiness, love. Like you won't you'll block yourself off from those things completely. Whereas if you do the good thing despite how you've what you've been through, how you're traumatized and all that, if you do the good despite those things, you end up feeling love, feeling happiness, feeling joy, at least in moments. You get breaks and you feel these things and you become something special. You become something special, which excuse me, would be like the truly heroic, not just like the cartoon hero, but like the truly heroic, which is maybe what our ancestors were talking about, in them old stories. And remember, they were facing things on a daily basis, which was trying to kill them, including other human beings. So anyway, there's always hope, and yeah, things aren't all bad yet. War is terrible, but things are not all bad.